The following organizations have provided funding for this Into the Outdoors television series.
Oh yeah, that's a beauty. I want to go deer hunting with my dad and grandpa next year, but they said I first needed to learn about deer as a species. Makes sense, right? So I did some research online, and now I'm scouting for deer. Oh boy, now I'm excited. I'm also excited at the thought of being able to complete hunter education and actually playing a role in wildlife conservation. I've learned that the wildlife populations are healthier now than they were 100 years ago. But that didn't happen without two things. First, we owe part of that wildlife success to America's pioneers in conservation. And then is today's conservation professionals who manage wildlife populations for everyone to enjoy. So grab your binoculars and hiking boots as we explore the history and future of wildlife management as we trek further into the outdoors.
Grab your gear and let's explore as we discover the wild outdoors. Science, discovery, it's what we do. You can make our Earth a bright and better place by joining us in this wide open space. Into the outdoors.
Ooh, there's a lot over there. You know, America's wildlife wasn't always this abundant. In fact, early settlers and market hunters thought that the herds of deer, elk, bison, and other wildlife would last forever.
So they used the nation's wildlife to feed the settlers. In 1870, market hunters killed an estimated 5 million buffalo that year alone. And by 1886, there were only 540 bison left in the entire United States, mostly in the Yellowstone area of Montana. America's wildlife was in serious trouble from a combination of human expansion, unregulated market hunting and habitat loss, and many wildlife species were on the verge of disappearing in many areas. But things began to turn around in 1872, when the outcry of early conservationists prompted President Ulysses S. Grant to establish our first national park, Yellowstone, that included over 3,300 square miles. More and more people pushed for conservation of America's wildlife, and in 1900, Congress passed the Lacey Game and Wild Birds Preservation and Disposition Act that made it illegal to transport wild game taken illegally across state borders. Then in 1901, Teddy Roosevelt became president and spearheaded a new era of wildlife conservation. He strongly believed in protecting as much land as possible for wildlife and public use. During his presidency, Roosevelt helped protect wildlife and habitat by establishing 148 million acres of land in 16 national monuments, 51 wildlife refuges, and 5 national parks.
Finally, in the early 1900s, the concept of wildlife conservation was starting to sweep across the country.
In the 1930s, another hunter and pioneer in wildlife conservation emerged as the father of wildlife management. Aldo Leopold became the first professor of game management at the University of Wisconsin. He wrote the first book on game management, where he said that a combination of ethics and science should be used in wildlife management and conservation. What a concept! Leopold and his writings helped educate a nation about the importance of an environmental ethic. Leopold said that ethical behavior is doing the right thing when no one else is watching, even when doing the wrong thing is legal. And that's part of the ethical code that responsible hunters use today.
If you think about it, the world might be a better place if everyone did what Leopold said. Do the right thing even when no one else is watching.
These pioneers in America's conservation inspired others and the U.S. Congress to pass the Pittman-Robertson Federal Aid in Wildlife Restoration Act in 1937. It created an 11% excise tax on all hunting firearms and ammunition, with the funds going back to the wildlife restoration projects, research, and education. So in the end, it's hunters paying those PR taxes, along with license sales that pay a huge part of wildlife conservation that all of us can enjoy. America's conservation pioneers, along with others, developed the North American Wildlife Conservation Model. This model has two important principles. First, our fish and wildlife belong to all Americans. And second, they need to be managed in a way so their populations will be sustained for future generations. And if you really want to learn more about it, including the 7 Sisters of Conservation, do your own online research on the North American Wildlife Conservation Model.
So that's the history of our wildlife management. Of course, the story doesn't end there. It's today's wildlife conservation professionals who continue to manage America's wildlife into the future.
So who are these people? What do they do? And could you become one of them someday? You're about to find out as we explore careers in conservation.
Leopold was right when he said that science is the foundation of managing wildlife. And scientists who manage wildlife are wildlife biologists. And as you're about to discover with our investigator, Sophie, it's a pretty exciting career.
All right, just a little bit to the left.
All right, how does this look? Is this all right?
Okay, that's looking great.
All right.
All right, I guess it makes sense to start with the history of all these elk we've been seeing.
At the turn of the 1900s, we were down to virtually 0 elk. They were extirpated in the state of New Mexico. And over the last 100 years, they've gone from 0 to what we have today, which is around 100,000 elk in New Mexico. So a really significant change.
I bet they're glad they hired you to turn things around.
No, certainly not me alone, but the North American model of wildlife conservation is built upon this idea that where there are seasons, there are bag limits, there are dates that people can go out and harvest these animals. The states have a quota of how many animals can actually be taken from an area, and so we have science that backs what hunters are going out there and doing.
Well, this can't be all science. This job looks like a blast.
Yeah, it probably looks like I'm just flying out here having fun in a helicopter and enjoying a joyride on the Valles Caldera, which is beautiful, but what we're actually doing is counting elk, so we can bring this data back to our desks, plug it into a model, and come up with a population estimate for how many elk are actually out here. And so when we do that, then we're able to calculate how many can be harvested in a sustainable way.
These elk are so impressive. It must be exciting to manage them.
Yeah, elk are a really dynamic visual species that are enjoyable to watch, but I work with a variety of species. Mule deer, bighorn sheep, pronghorn, javelina, which are interesting.
These bulls are so big and majestic. Hunting them's gotta be a rush.
Yeah, there are a lot of things that make elk hunting attractive to different people. For example, I appreciate being able to harvest a wild animal on the landscape and bring it back home to my friends and family for food. Other people enjoy bugling an elk into them. They think that's a very spiritual experience. And everyone that goes into the high country to hunt elk, they've had an awesome experience. They have stories to share with their friends. They may or may not have harvested, but they still have a great story to tell.
But what other things do you do managing wildlife?
As a wildlife biologist, we do way more than just fly around in helicopters and collect data and numbers and go back to our office and run the data. For example, out here, we did a capture a couple of years ago for elk, where we captured both calves and adult females, and we put GPS collars on the adult females. Yeah, and it's pretty cool the way that we do it. In the helicopter, we fly and we chase these animals. We fire this net that goes over the animal, it captures it really quickly. We're able to jump out, put a collar on it, let it go real fast and see where they're going on the landscape, what they're using, and ideally help that inform our management recommendations.
Well, I'm sure there's more to it than wrestling elk.
Managing wildlife is a balancing act between several things. So we don't want too many elk on the landscape. If there were too many elk on the landscape, they would essentially eat themselves out of house and home, and that would destroy the landscape and the habitat for other species, and there wouldn't be as many songbirds or other species on the landscape that we also enjoy.
It sounds like you're managing for biodiversity and healthy ecosystems. It'd be so cool to have your job.
Yeah, being a wildlife biologist is very exciting, so I highly recommend it. I would get outside, see wildlife, ask a lot of questions, take classes in science and math. But at the end of the day, what I appreciate most is being part of something bigger, being able to see that a population of elk or whatever it may be is part of a larger ecosystem, and that ecosystem is functional. So playing my part in, making sure wildlife is here for future generations and that intact ecosystems are there really benefits people as well, because we're part of the ecosystem also.
Anything else?
One of the great things about being a conservation professional today is the diversity of people that are in this profession has changed drastically over the last 30 years. We come in all shapes and sizes, and we can still do the job. I highly recommend becoming a wildlife biologist.
No kidding. It's gonna be high on my list.
Another reason why we have such healthy wildlife today is because we protect that wildlife with a combination of game laws and professionals who enforce those laws. They're conservation officers. Let's find out what they do with our junior investigator, Jillian.
Why is there a need for your job?
We have a lot of laws, statutes, regulations that protect our natural resources.
But sometimes the laws aren't enough, so that's where we come into play as conservation officers.
So the majority of the hunters, anglers, trappers that we contact are trying to obey the law. When we contact them in the field, they're happy to see us, they're happy to talk to us, and we're happy to talk to them. We get really good at it.
But there are those people that, and it's a minority of people, that don't follow the laws and regulations that we have in place. It's unfortunate, but that's why our job is necessary.
What special law enforcement training do you need?
So we have to go to a regular law enforcement academy. I went to an academy for 16 weeks.
And then when you complete the police academy, we have our own 6-week game and fish recruit school that we put our recruits through. And that includes learning the laws and regulations, going through reality-based training, scenarios. Maybe it's an individual that doesn't have a fishing license, or maybe it's just an individual that's doing absolutely nothing wrong. And these are all real scenarios that you could encounter as a game warden or as a conservation officer in the field. And we want to make sure our young officers are prepared for those scenarios. We do so many other things that involve conservation or revolve around conservation.
And we do a lot of OHV patrol to make sure people aren't driving four-wheelers off of dirt roads, things like that.
Wildlife management projects,
Right.
fisheries management projects. We do a lot of information education, public outreach. We teach hunter education. So really all wrapped up, we're protecting so many different parts of an ecosystem. We're protecting the wildlife. We're helping conservationists make sure that they have wildlife for future generations.
Right now it's hunting season, and I spend a lot of time out in the woods checking those hunters, trying to keep them honest, make sure that they have their carcass tags properly notched and filled out after they've harvested something, make sure that they have a license to be hunting, that they're utilizing the correct weapon type for their hunt.
And licenses are very important to us because that's ultimately what funds our agency. It's that money that sportsmen spend on the license that allows us to complete the cycle of conservation and put that funding back into the field, back into the fisheries work, the wildlife work, and the law enforcement work that we do. And that's conservation for everybody to enjoy. Well, it's also fishing season right now. In fact, it's always fishing season. We're always out trying to check anglers in between checking hunters in the fall. So one of the first things we look for is that anglers have licenses. And that's important because it's those dollars spent on fishing licenses that allow us to stock our rivers and streams and lakes with fish. And if we didn't have those license dollars, we wouldn't be able to fund our fish hatcheries.
But there's a lot more to this job than just checking hunters and anglers.
Yeah, it's very common for us to deal with interactions between wildlife and humans. We call that depredation. And in a world where we have so many humans living in it and our populations of wildlife are very healthy, these types of problems are very common. Some examples of that could include elk in a hayfield, destroying a farmer's crops, or
Bears in dumpsters.
bears in homes,
Raccoons getting into your doggy door and eating your dog's food.
foxes under my shed, bobcat in my backyard, bobcat eating my chickens. We deal with that one a lot.
So to help minimize these conflicts, we do a lot of education about how to safely interact with wildlife.
They've never had that bear in their yard before, or maybe they just moved to an area that has mountain lions in it. So we want to educate them on how not to attract those animals, how not to have those negative interactions with those animals.
If I wanted to be a conservation officer, what would I have to study in college?
You might want to think about studying wildlife, science, biology, criminal justice. We accept a wide range of four-year degrees.
I also think it's super important, if you want to be a conservation officer, get involved in hunting and fishing and trapping. Become a hunter, become an angler, become a trapper, and start experiencing the outdoors and some of these things in nature that you're going to experience as part of this career. And if that's something that you're passionate about, something that you love, then hey, this is maybe just the right job for you.
So if you're thinking about being a conservation officer, you better think school is cool.
Because you're going to need a four-year degree.
And that's how you be a conservation officer.
We have lots of wildlife today and professionals who manage that wildlife. But what's our final conservation career that we need to ensure the future of wildlife conservation? It's professionals who educate the public and also recruit the next generation to support wildlife conservation.
All right, let's explore more conservation careers. Take one. What's the history of conservation careers here?
The New Mexico Department of Game and Fish is well over 100 years old, and it started back in the early 1900s with conservation officers, then known as game wardens. So over the years, we have grown as an agency to include biologists, both terrestrial and aquatic biologists, and then a huge team of information and education staff to help bring the public into what we do as a conservation agency.
It sounds like a lot of different careers, but who pays for all those professionals?
So the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish is funded solely from the sale of hunting and fishing licenses and federal taxes that are collected on hunting and fishing equipment. So wildlife populations across the country are starting to increase, while the number of hunting licenses getting sold are starting to decrease. You might wonder about that conflict that's going to occur as those two start to go further across. Now here in New Mexico, we're pretty lucky because our number of hunting license sales are staying pretty much steady across the board. And this is really good news here in New Mexico because hunting licenses pay for conservation across not only big game species, but also some of the smaller critters, some voles and birds and lizards and snakes. And that is all funded through the sale of hunting and fishing licenses. So that all of the citizens, both New Mexico residents and people who visit New Mexico, benefit from seeing wildlife in this great state.
But what if the number of hunters declines?
So because the number of hunting licenses is on the decline across the United States, and because we're worried that that might affect us here in New Mexico, we have a series of programs that are called Hunter and Angler Recruitment, Retention, and Reactivation, or R3 for short. So these programs are designed to get people of all ages engaged in hunting and fishing activities. Because a hunter, deep down, becomes really engaged with the local world around them. So when you're out hunting and you have a bull elk or a cow elk come by, your heart starts pounding and you get excited and you care about what's out there. So through these R3 programs, we're not only creating people that care about the animals and the wildlife and the ecosystem in this area, but also creating a new funding source for the agency. So if you really break down the R3 concept, getting a whole family engaged in outdoor pursuits such as hunting is really exciting. I mean, think about it. How cool is it if you're out there with a child, a parent, like a daughter in my case, and a parent and a grandparent out there enjoying the outdoor environments all together? So really, through all of this, you have a true extension on America's hunting heritage. For me, the engagement that I've had in the R3 programs, it's truly amazing when you're out in the field, whether you're just going shooting or whether you're going hunting, and somebody has that moment where they harvest an animal or they hit their first clay target or they shoot the bow for the first time, and you just see their eyes light up. And you know that this isn't a passion that's going to be one day and it's going to disappear at the end of the day or the end of the week, but it's something that's going to sustain them and bring them back into the outdoor recreation industry and keep them engaged in our history and our heritage and engaged with our wildlife.
What tools do you use with your R3 programs?
An important part of hunter recruitment, retention, and reactivation is the education. Hunter education in this country has been around for over 50 years, and it's an important part of the process because to become a good, responsible, ethical hunter, it's important to know how wildlife is managed across the country. You learn about carrying capacities and how we know how many animals we can harvest from the field and make it educational. You learn about safety and survival. You learn about the laws and regulations, which is really important. And while every law can't be covered, you also learn where to go to find the rest of the rules so that you can become a knowledgeable, educated, and ethical hunter. So if you're interested in taking a hunter education class, and it's strongly recommended that everybody, no matter your age or if you have experienced hunting, it's always great to go back and get a refresher. It's really easy. Just go to the Game and Fish website and click on the Hunter Education tab. And there are different methods which you can use to take hunter education. You can come into a classroom setting and go through the step one by one. It's a really hands-on, engaging, activity-based in a classroom setting with somebody who has been hunting for quite a few years. And often our agency staff, our conservation officers, our hunter education staff are in the classroom there as well. You can also do an online program, and you can work through that whole process online and get your certification at the end. We also have a home study program where you can get the information and then come to a shortened class and have the hands-on activities in that class. So you have no reason at all for not taking hunter education.
Is there anything else we should think about if we're considering a career in conservation?
So do you want a career where you just sit at a desk all day and work at a computer? Or do you want a career where you can get outside, work with wildlife, ride in helicopters, become a conservation officer, become a biologist, and spend your time outside? The choice is all yours.
Yep, you have all kinds of choices in life. From doing the right thing even when no one else is watching, like Leopold said, to choices in what career you'll have someday. As for me, there's no choice, only a direction as I continue further into the outdoors.
Grab your gear and let's explore as we discover the wild outdoors. Science, discovery, it's what we do. You can make our Earth a bright and better place by joining us in this wide open space into the outdoors.
The following organizations have provided funding for this Into the Outdoors television series.